have more follow-up questions. So, Don, really happy to have you here today.
Well, good morning, everybody. I want to apologize beforehand. Been traveling a lot the last few weeks, and I've caught a cold during the whole process of traveling, but hopefully that's not too much of a distraction this morning. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, great. Well, it's sort of nice to be back in Kentucky again. It's the last time I was here was a little bit more stressful. I had an alfalfa variety that was doing very well in the grazing trials here in Kentucky, and Ray called me up and he said, well, we're getting ready to, we've got all the data we want off that field, and we're getting ready to terminate that field, and do you want to come down and make selections out of it to, fine-tune the future varieties for Kentucky out of that material? And so I flew down, and the day I got here, Gene Olson helped me dig plants out of the field under a tornado watch. And we were in rain gear, but we did get our plants, and I was real happy for all the assistance and getting some good breeding material to move forward in my breeding program. So what I'd like to do today is give you sort of a plant breeder's perspective of what's new in an alfalfa, maybe cover a little bit of what we've done in the past, how far we've come, things that might be that you could look for forward in the future, things that are being worked on, and maybe give you an update on some things that are currently happening. So, current status of the alfalfa industry, past, how far have we come, recent significant improvements, the status of difficult traits that are hard to breed for, and the future, what do I see in the future, the things that alfalfa breeders might be concentrating on. I think there's a lot of work that can be done on what I call climate change genetics, things that with the changing climate, can we breed for alfalfa that can buffer against those changes, and new expanded roles for alfalfa, maybe roles that we've had for alfalfa in the past that haven't been fully utilized but maybe are becoming more important as we move forward. Now, over the years, alfalfa acres in the United States have decreased somewhat, and I think part of that is because of the competition with other crops in that total mixed ration. The corn people have really encroached into the dairy feed aspect, and as a result, we've seen the acres of alfalfa decrease over time. We're still an important crop, that top 3 or 4 crops in the U.S., but again, the acres have changed a little bit over time, and as a result, what we're seeing is a change in the alfalfa breeding industry. When I was in graduate school looking for a job when I got my PhD, there were a lot of private breeding companies out there that were developing alfalfa varieties. In the 70s to 2000, there were 7 to 8 large proprietary alfalfa companies breeding alfalfa varieties. And the universities, the public institutions, the land-grant colleges, they were doing a lot of work on alfalfa. There was about 10 programs that were pretty active across the United States that were developing alfalfa germplasm, or even in some cases alfalfa varieties. But after about 2000, when the alfalfa acres started decreasing somewhat, you started seeing a consolidation of the industry. Some of the proprietary companies bought out the other companies, and there was just a whole change in the industry. There was less breeding companies developing new alfalfa varieties, and also there was a shift in the universities. The universities that had in the past developed alfalfa varieties or germplasm were shifting, mainly only doing basic research on alfalfa, not really developing germplasm or even alfalfa varieties. And so over time, the industry has changed, and as a result, now what used to be 7 to 10 alfalfa companies breeding alfalfa varieties, there's only 2 to 3 companies now that are developing alfalfa varieties, the majority of the varieties that you might see being released today. And the remaining companies have significantly downsized their alfalfa breeding program, especially in the development of semi and non-dormant. If you're familiar with fall dormancy, that's how we gauge whether a variety is adapted to a cold climate or a warm climate. A fall dormancy of 1 would be something like up in Canada. A fall dormancy 10 might be in Southern California. So most of the companies that are breeding alfalfa now are concentrating on the 2 to maybe 5 fall dormancies instead of spending much work on fall dormancies 6 to 10. So there's a strategic change in the alfalfa breeding that's being done. But we have come a long ways. When I first started looking at trying to improve alfalfa for improvement in yield, breeders were looking at, well, here we developed a variety, it has this certain yield potential, but if there was a disease, it took away from that yield. That variety couldn't hit its maximum yield potential because of, say, phytophtha or root rot or anthracnose or some of the major diseases. And so in the early years, everybody was actually trying to improve the disease resistance of our alfalfa varieties as a means of keeping our alfalfa yields up. And so you can see that, an old variety, you still hear people planting vernal. It was developed in 1954. But you can see how we've come over time, the yields and then also the persistence in that alfalfa and out in the field. We have come a long ways compared to the old varieties, and we're approaching maybe even close to, well, we have even newer material now that newer proprietary varieties that can probably double the yield that the varieties that we had in the 50s. And so we have come a long ways, and a lot of that yield stabilization, I guess you might call, is from improving alfalfa varieties for disease and insect resistance that detracted from yield. Now, as we move forward, plant breeders are now concentrating a little bit more on selecting directly for yield, but all in the early years we were selecting for anything that detracted from yield, say the diseases and the insects that are out there causing reduction in stand life and also production. Whoop. There we go. Okay, here's another, we talk about fall dormancy a little bit. If you're not familiar with fall dormancy in alfalfa, it's a means of determining where a new alfalfa variety might be adapted to grow. Alfalfa originally was from the Middle East and was adapted to very warm temperatures, but as it moved across the world, across Europe, and then eventually into North America and South America, it got planted in environments that were, say, more cold climates, and so the varieties the alfalfa that was planted in a cold climate, some of those plants died, but the ones that survived then eventually evolved that variety into something that could take a colder climate. And so as plant breeders, we took advantage of this knowing that there were plants that could be grown in cold climates and could be grown in warm climates. And we found out that alfalfa, the ones that were adapted to cold climates, actually could respond to day length. As the days started getting shorter, the ones that could survive the winter started shutting down, stopped all their growth in the fall, and were preparing and saving their root reserves for next year. And so they were shutting down and protecting that. The plants that couldn't survive the winters were the ones that kept growing in the fall. They got frosted back, they grew again, got frosted back, and eventually those plants would die and wouldn't survive out in the field. But the ones that did shut down and go that fall dormancy were the ones that could survive. And so what we did as plant breeders was eventually develop a scale of 1 to, say, 10, and categorizing all the alfalfa varieties that were being released in the U.S. In those scales. And sort of a rule of thumb is if you had a variety that had a fall dormancy of a 9, that might be 9 cuts. Something up in Canada that you might only get 1 cut might have a fall dormancy of a 1, but sort of a general rule of thumb. A 4 might get 4 cuts in a season. But again, we had a gradation depending on how severe the winters were, and we could categorize alfalfa varieties based on the fall growth and also that spring growth. We know that a fall dormancy 5 would be growing farther into the fall than a 4, and also that 5 would wake up earlier in the spring than a 4. So it would grow a little bit more on each end of that season because of its reaction to day length. And so that was a very useful tool for a lot of years. But we knew that if we took, say, a fall dormancy 9, we planted it up in Montana or farther north, it might do good during the summer, but as it approached fall, it kept growing and would get frosted back and just wouldn't survive and would winter kill. But we also knew that these more non-dormant varieties had a little bit more yield potential. And so a fall dormancy 5 generally out-yielded a 4 generally out-yielded a 3, again because of their response to day length and growing a little bit longer into the fall or waking up a little bit earlier in the spring. But, when we started releasing all these varieties, we might have 40 or 50 fall dormancy 4s that were being released in the United States. Well, people were always looking for a little bit more yield and said, well, instead of a 4, could I plant a 5? And they might plant a 5, get a yield kick until they got one winter that maybe was a little bit more severe, and then that 5 got winter kill, and so everybody jumped back to a 4. Well, we knew that as another way of approaching higher yield, can we take these fall dormancy 5s and put them in areas where a fall dormancy 4 was being grown, or even a 6, put it into an area where 5 was being grown. We needed a tool to be able to tell which of those fall dormancy 5s could survive the winter better than others. Maybe we had 40 fall dormancy 5s, and 2 or 3 of those could actually take a winter more than the other ones. And so we came up with a second scale called a fall dormancy or winter survival rating, and that was on a scale of 1 to 6. If we let the varieties actually go through the winter, and if they survived, we gave them a score of a 1. 2 was a little bit of damage, but not much. 3 had more winter survival damage, and all the way up to a 6, it would die. And so that gave us a second tool of being able to see if we could push that fall dormancy a little bit farther north and get that yield kick that give us a bit more yield. And so now if you select an alfalfa variety and you want to make sure that it can survive the winter, we want to make sure that you select your fall dormancy. You might be able to push, maybe in the past you've only done 4s, but now you want to do a 5. As long as you have a winter survival rating of a 2 or less, that gives you an insurance policy of saying that variety you can go a little bit farther north with it as long as it has that winter survival rating of a 2. So that's what breeders are now looking at, of increasing the forage yield of alfalfa by pushing those non-dormants or semi-dormants a little bit farther north because they have better yield potential. And now the grower has that additional information if we can go a little bit farther north as long as that winter survival rating is 2 or lower. So that's the thing that's been done in the last, say, 15 years. We're seeing, when I got out of graduate school, they sent me from New Mexico to Idaho. Everybody there was growing 3s and 4s. Nobody had grown a 5. We developed a 5 that could survive the winters in Idaho, and we topped all the yield trials. So it's another way of improving yield, but we need to make sure that we survive the winter and that can have a variety that is going to persist over several years. So this is what fall dormancy looks like. Here's a fall dormancy 4, a fall dormancy 5. They were both cut at the same time, but you can see this 5 is coming back a few days earlier than the 4. And that's the same thing that you'll see in the spring. The 5 will wake up earlier in the spring than the 4. The 4 will wake up earlier than a 3 will. And also the same thing going into the fall. The fall dormancy 5 will have more growth going into the fall, and the 4 will start shutting down because the day lengths are getting shorter and it's responding to the day length. So again, that's what fall dormancy does for you. But again, that 5 has more yield potential than the 4. And if we can get that 5 to persist in that cold environment with that knowledge of that winter survival rating, then you have that yield kick that can really be beneficial to your program. Again, this is the scale. Fall dormancy 1 to 10. 1 would be a fall dormancy that for Canada, say a 10 for Southern California or Mexico. And then here's a winter survival rating. Again, if you want to push that envelope, a 5 that has a winter survival rating of a 2, you can go almost anywhere in the U.S. As far as being able to have a little bit of confidence that it's going to survive the winter. But by changing that dormancy from a 4 to a 5, you're getting a yield kick. The other significant genetic advances that we've seen in the last few years is fiber digestibility, improvement in forage quality in alfalfa. You may have heard the low lignin alfalfas, varieties that also have more leaves, higher leaf to stem ratio. We've developed varieties that have more leaves on those plants. Again, those are things that are contributing to the forage quality. If we can have that alfalfa, more of that straw is more digestible, then we have a better output on the milk production or animal performance. And also, if we got more leaves, we got more crude protein. So again, both those factors are important in in forage quality, and been really significant advances here in the last few years as far as alfalfa improvement for forage quality. Now, with these new advantages of this, of the reduced lignin or better fiber digestibility and improvement in leaf to stem ratio, more leaves on that plant. In the past, we used to measure the quality of alfalfa using relative feed value. That was good in its time, and we could buy and sell alfalfa based on relative feed quality. But now, with the new technology, these improvements in fiber digestibility, improvements in leaf to stem ratio, more leaves, RFV doesn't pick up those advantages in its calculation. RFV will not pick up the improvement in leaf, more leaves on the plant. It doesn't pick up that advantage of more crude protein. That doesn't go into that calculation. And also the fiber digestibility, these new lines that have better fiber digestibility, and RFV doesn't pick that up. So if you're going to buy some of these newer varieties that have that better quality from the fiber digestibility, the low lignin, or the more leaf to stem ratio, you have to use a RFQ, a relative feed quality analysis, to pick up that advantage, because the RFV doesn't pick that up. So, we've moved beyond the RFV, and so if you're really trying to market your alfalfa based on quality, you need to know that you have the measuring stick to actually say that you do have that quality, and you can use that in marketing your alfalfa and know how much better your variety is performing on forage quality. Also, with these new varieties that have been released in the last few years, you're starting out with better forage quality, a higher level in that plant, and so that gives you a little bit more flexibility, that what we call harvest flexibility, where that window of harvest can be modified. Say in the past, you were getting ready to cut, and then all of a sudden you got a weather event coming in. You're going to have to delay cutting for a few days to avoid that rainstorm before you cut. Well, a lot of times you miss the window of opportunity for good dairy quality hay. Well, with these new varieties that have better fiber digestibility, more crude protein from the leaves, you have a wider harvest window than what we've had in the past. And so you could delay the harvest of that field a few days and still have some dairy quality hay that with the older varieties we didn't have that option on. We're also, like I said, we've done a lot of work as plant breeders in improving the disease resistance to alfalfa, phytophthora, anthracnose. But every time you solve one problem, another one pops up that was the next limiting factor. And so after we did all that work in the, say, the 70s and 80s on phytophthora, and we got phytophthora-resistant varieties, then we didn't even know that Aphanomyces existed. It was another disease that occurred in these wet soils. And so after we had a control of phytophthora, then we started looking at race 1 Aphanomyces. And so we developed alfalfa varieties that have resistance to race 1. Then all of a sudden, once we had resistance to race 1, then race 2 started showing up. There was different races out there. And now most recently, they're even talking about a race 3. And so that is, when you look at an alfalfa variety, if you've had problems with, say, damping off in the spring or damage from wet soils, these having additional resistance to all the multiple races of the Aphanomyces has really been beneficial. Here you can see a planting of alfalfa where they only had resistance to one race versus one that had multiple resistance to all the races. And so get a better stand. That's really important for that persistence of that field out there in production. And so that has been another thing that you're starting to see. We released varieties for race 1, and then all of a sudden people say, well, I need race 2, and then now they're saying we need all 3 of these races. Excuse me. Also now, we did a lot of work on the original anthracnose. Probably we can call it race 1, but now they're saying that there's a new race of anthracnose, and so there are varieties out there now that are being developed that have some race 5 resistance. And again, if you had problems with these in the past, you can look at that national list of alfalfa varieties, and you're starting to see some that are having these additional disease resistance to these newer races of these important diseases. Now, the status of difficult traits, as plant breeders, we always are looking at, can we solve a problem with just improving the genetics of the alfalfa. Alfalfa weevil was something we've looked at for years. Armyworm, been a lot of talked about armyworm. Can we select for genetic resistance in alfalfa to those pests? Well, really, we've tried as plant breeders, but really no varieties with resistance to either one of these or any of the worms, cutworms, armyworms, whatever worms you're out there. Really, your only thing is that you can do is monitor your fields and spray if you have to. But really, we haven't been able to develop any alfalfa varieties up until this point that have genetic resistance that we could say are resistant to the weevil or the armyworm or any of the other worms. So possibly in the future with GMO, I haven't seen anything in the literature or any reports recently, but possibly in the future that might be the one way of doing it. But conventional plant breeding, we have not had any success in doing that. Now, before the talk today, Ray sent me a list of things that people wanted to maybe know a little bit more about. He mentioned cloverroot cucurleo, and then I added a few other things that might be important to you today to learn a little bit more about. Cloverroot cucurleo, we actually have them out west, but there are a problem here in Kentucky also. And so this is what it looks like. It's sort of related to the alfalfa weevil. The adults look very similar. This is the cloverroot cucurleo adult, but that looks pretty close to the alfalfa weevil adult. The difference being that the alfalfa weevil, when she lays her eggs, they damage the leaves of the alfalfa plant. The cloverroot cucurleo, when she lays her eggs, they go for the root. And you can see this alfalfa root, they're just chewing all the bark of that root and really decimating a lot of that plant down below ground. And this is what the larvae, they're chewing on the bark of the plant, and that's opening up that plant to a lot of diseases. And so you get secondary infections. Just the damage from the feeding on the root is one thing. You don't get as much nutrient uptake. Water can be an issue. If you have water stress, if you've got cloverroot cucurleo, that can be a problem. But again, they're chewing on that root and damaging the root. The interesting thing about the cloverroot cucurleo, we haven't had any genetic resistance to it. We don't have any varieties we can say that we can offer to you that have genetic resistance. Crop rotation to a non-legume is one thing that you can look at. Spring planting date, you're trying to, instead of planting in the fall, plant in the spring, that new first year of alfalfa would have less of a problem with the cloverroot cucurleo. Irrigation and fertility. Out west, I've had fields where they've lost irrigation, the pump went down, and if you had severe cloverroot cucurleo damage out in the field, then that damage to that root really was enhanced by not having enough water uptake into that plant, and we've lost fields. So you need to make sure you reduce as much stress, make sure you have good fertility, and get the healthiest plants that you can, and hopefully they can recover from whatever damage that we're seeing out there. The interesting thing that has happened in the last few years, there's another insect back east that's similar to the cloverroot cucurleo, but they're actually using biological control. There's some beneficial nematodes that they've been rearing and introducing into the field that will actually feed on these larvae. And so that's been done by Cornell University. I talked to Dr. Vyans about a year ago, and he said they were getting some control with this new biological control. And so maybe going forward, that might be something that we can look at. And he was also trying to do a little bit of selection for just getting genetic resistance, but again, small incremental improvements. But again, there is being some work done on that, and maybe the biologicals might be some type of answer. Autotoxicity. We know that when we grow alfalfa for 3 or 4 years, we would rather you not follow alfalfa with alfalfa. There's a toxin that's put down into the top layer of the soil that sort of prevents alfalfa seedlings from germinating. It's not always a problem, but there's enough of an issue there that we generally recommend that if you raise alfalfa for 3 or 4 years, rotate out for at least I like a year, but if you rotate out in the fall, maybe you could plant in the spring. But again, there's a chemical, every time you cut alfalfa, you have a little bit of leaf shatter, and there's a chemical, as those leaves stay on that soil surface, there's a chemical that leaches out of those leaves and is deposited in that top inch of the soil. And over time, say if you've had that field out there 2-3 years, there's enough of those chemicals in that top layer that when you come back out there and try to plant alfalfa seed, it retards the development of those seeds, and some seeds won't germinate, or if they do germinate, they'll die, again, depending on how much that toxin is in that top layer. Now, autotoxicity, if you've only had that field out there for a year and a year or less, and you had a bad stand, there's not enough autotoxicity occurring in that first year to be a problem because it builds up over time. So if you have a poor stand and you want to take that stand out after that first year or thicken it up with some new alfalfa seed, you can do that. But in that second, third, fourth year, it might be more of an issue to thicken up an old alfalfa stand that's thinning out. So there is some work being done on autotoxicity in alfalfa. There's recently Michigan State University got $1 million grant to look at autotoxicity in alfalfa. They're actually trying to develop a bioassay soil test where they could take soil from your field, do a quick bioassay and tell you, do you have a potential problem with autotoxicity, or you don't have a problem. And so that's in the stage of development right now. And also that grant, they're going to try to breed for autotoxicity plants that don't, and the leaves don't deposit as much of that chemical into that top layer of the soil. So again, there's money being shot towards that, and if nothing else, having a bioassay that can tell you, well, do you have a problem, potential problem? Can I plant now, or do I need to rotate out for a longer period of time? So that is in the works. Okay, again, difficult traits. There has been a lot of work being done on trying to develop bloat tolerance in alfalfa. A lot of parts of the world, they do graze alfalfa, but bloat is always a concern. I used to do a lot of work down in Argentina, and they graze pure stands of alfalfa all the time, and they just know how to manage it. There's certain things that you can do to reduce the potential of bloat, but there's always in the back of your mind there, are you going to have bloat when you graze alfalfa? And so Canada tried to release a variety a number of years ago that was supposedly bloat tolerant, but that didn't pan out. And then there's also a lot of work been done on GMO, but to this date there is no varieties that have been released that can have that claim of not causing bloat in cattle that graze alfalfa. So right now you can very successfully graze alfalfa. You just have to, the animal and crop management is your best option. Again, in Argentina, in other parts of the world, it's being done quite successfully. Here in the southeast, in Kentucky, they're doing grazing trials here. I was involved in a lot of that work when Georgia was developing the alpha graze, and we partnered up with University of Georgia and developed some alfalfa lines that were grazing tolerant, that could survive the grazing damage from the hooves and the continuous grazing. But again, that question of bloat was always out there, and so. But you can graze alfalfa, and there are some booklets out there that can show you how to do that. Also, last year I was touring some of the plots in the University of Georgia, and they were actually screening for alfalfa growth in acid soils, low pHs, aluminum toxicity. And so for years and years, breeders were looking at that. Dr. Joe Boughton initially looked at some of that in Georgia, but now there seemed to be some movement in a positive direction. So maybe in the future we'll have a little bit more tolerance to these low pH soils where we've had to put lime on all those fields in the past. And in those low pH soils here, especially in the southeast, aluminum toxicity was another issue. So there's some work being done, and we'll follow that moving forward and see how that's looking. So the future of alfalfa breeding for tolerances to stress. We keep hearing these extremes in climate, extreme droughts or floods or all these extreme heat. Again, plant breeders are currently developing alfalfa varieties that can buffer alfalfa yields against the adverse effects of extreme weather and environmental stresses using what I call climate change genetics. So can we develop these alfalfas that can tolerate extended drought periods or tolerate salinity or things that our environment is throwing at us and changing the environments where we normally grow in alfalfa. Drought stress is considered one of the most limiting factors in crop production, and so parts of the U.S. We have irrigation, but sometimes we don't. Some of those areas are losing the irrigation that they have, and so other parts of the country, that maybe the rainfall patterns have changed somewhat, and you're not getting as much rain on your fields that's for optimal production. And you can see if you look at the U.S. Drought Monitor over time, we've had droughts and heat stress in a lot of parts of the country, and so alfalfa breeders are looking at can we get better performance improving the genetics of the alfalfa in that direction. Here's just a quick slide on anytime we have drought, a lot of times, especially if we have irrigation, we keep adding water to that field, but with that water there's salt in that water in minute amounts, and so if you limit the amount of irrigation, you can't leach the salts out of the soil profile. And so we've actually taken alfalfa varieties, exposed them to salt when they're germinating. You can see this is EC20. That's half the concentration of seawater. We do have some seeds that are germinating. We rescue those and use those as breeding lines, and eventually we can come up with lines that can have that level of germination at half the concentration of seawater. So we're moving forward on a lot of these stresses out there that can be limiting to alfalfa. We've actually, the company I'm working for, we've actually partnered with New Mexico State University. They just released some varieties on that less than optimal moisture. Can we get comparable production with 20% less water? And also what they're saying is drought resilience. Can we have alfalfas that go through a period of drought that actually quit growing because there's no water to grow? Will they come back once water is restored out there? And so this is just a quick shot of a field in New Mexico where this field hasn't been watered for about 3 months during the summer. No irrigation, no rainfall, and then looks like it's hardly growing at all. It's gone into a drought-induced dormancy. Without the water, it just quits. It looks like it's dead. But when you do get water back, this is what it looked like. This was late in the fall. This is what it looked like the next spring when they did get water back. So we are looking at selecting those varieties that are resilient, those varieties that can come back after a drought-induced dormancy or periods of extreme drought. New and expanded roles of alfalfa. We've always known that alfalfa in the rotation gives us nitrogen fixation, but I think we've sort of forgot how valuable that is with the increase in nitrogen prices out there. Alfalfa can contribute about 200 units to succeeding crops in nitrogen. So, if the cost of nitrogen fertilizer is really prohibitive and going to cost you a lot of money to really grow the next crop, the corn or the wheats or the sorghums, using alfalfa in that rotation can really help you on the cost of your nitrogen. Whoop. There we go. Other thing we're hearing about is carbon sequestration. They're trying to develop revenue streams, and alfalfa is one of those crops that does put a lot of material organic material down into the soil. Alfalfa can have roots that can go down 20, 25 feet. And so it could sequester a lot of carbon. And that's being looked at in some of the universities as another revenue source, credit that the farmer could get for raising alfalfa. 178 pounds per acre per year of carbon sequestration from alfalfa. And so they're going forward, that might be something that could be a benefit. The other thing, the USDA is doing a lot of work on looking at the root system of alfalfa. They're developing breeding lines that have the branch root. There's also some commercial companies that have released some varieties with that branch root. We see that type of root structure has some advantages in a hard pan or a high water table. And also that branch root seems to have some of the varieties that we developed with grazing and traffic tolerance also have a very massive root system too compared to the tap. And so there are some advantages that, and there are varieties out there on the market now, and we'll probably see more of those going forward, but a new type of genetics that might be available to you in the future. Less traditional uses, a lot of the U.S., they don't graze alfalfa. In Argentina, I toured Argentina for a number of years in large-scale grazing of pure stands of alfalfa grass fields, but again, they were very successful in grazing alfalfa. The largest dairy in Argentina grazed their dairy animals on alfalfa. So again, it can be done, and you just have to be aware of what you can and can't do as far as management. But again, I think we're going to start seeing more use of alfalfa grazing in the U.S. I think there's grazing trials here in Kentucky, but University of Georgia and Florida, all those areas in the southeast where the rainfall patterns make it difficult to harvest alfalfa for hay. Grazing seems an alternative that we can really look at as being beneficial going forward. So grazing pure stands of alfalfa or alfalfa grass mixes, I think that improves productivity and reduces harvest costs. But again, alfalfa grass mixes, the alfalfa contribute to the nitrogen fixation and nitrogen there. So I think at the end of the day, the combination of these new varieties that are bred to complement each other really has some advantages in that grazing aspect. There's been a couple of new publications. This one's from Ray here in Kentucky, grazing alfalfa, and then also alfalfa Bermuda grass. That's at the NAFA website. You can get that information on the grazing. But again, I think summary, we're looking at improved yields, forage quality, and all these beneficial things here. Climate change genetics, salinity tolerance, drought tolerance, anything that's as far as stress related on alfalfa. And economic use of nitrogen fertilizer, nitrogen fixation, and these newer lines, branch root, carbon sequestration. Alfalfa is going to be used on more marginal ground. A lot of times the best ground is being grown on corn or some of the other crops, but alfalfa really has a fit in some of those other areas. So, with that, covered a lot of stuff. If there's any questions, I can try to answer those. Also, I've done work on teff grass. I wrote that publication, so if there's any questions on teff.
Questions for Don?
Yes, sir.
Have you done any work with alfalfa production on fragipan soils, which are generally not ideal for alfalfa?
Repeat the question, Don.
Say it again.
Have you done any work with alfalfa production on fragipan soils?
Fragipan soils, have not done anything on that, no. We haven't done any breeding for that type of soil, but I think going forward, if there is a limitation of alfalfa production on those type of soils, we can select for it. So, but we haven't at this point. So.
So a branch-rooted type might have a better chance where that fragipan causes a high water table. That would be.
Oh, okay.
Even try,
Okay. Well, we're actually have varieties that we're going to try in the northeast, where the high water table is a factor. And so, yeah, if there's a high water table in the soil profile, that's where that branch root really will be an advantage. So. Any other question?
While you're thinking, I want to highlight a couple of things that Don mentioned that'll be practical things to take home. So the publications, Grazing Alfalfa and Alfalfa Bermuda Grass, we have copies of that over there on the table. You can download those at alfalfa.org, that National Alfalfa website. There's a great publication called Alfalfa Analyst. They're not making hard copies anymore, but we've got some here, and that's also on 7 in Kentucky, I wouldn't encourage you to plant that.
It's an old map.
But definitely 5s can fit. And then let me ask a question, and I think Chris has one. Buffalo is an old variety of alfalfa. And on the surface, it appears that it's still sold in Kentucky. You can buy bags of seed that have buffalo stamped across the front. Do you think there's actually any, because people will say, I planted that and it did well. Can you comment on that?
The question was on buffalo alfalfa, and it's an older variety. The interesting thing is that when I was still in college, we used buffalo as a susceptible check for some of the aphids, because the aphids really just destroyed buffalo. They grew very well on it. But whether or not there's still buffalo out there, it's probably not the same buffalo that was originally.
So my comment is, if you see a bag that has buffalo stamped on it, and it was a whole variety, at least back in the 40s, I think it was, look on this, in fact, anything you buy, if you look on the white seed tag that has the germination information, that's going to document the variety that's in that bag. Buffalo, because it's been known in Kentucky, it'll be stamped on the outside of the bag. It's almost like a brand name. If you look at the white tag, it doesn't have that listed. If it has B&S listed, it means variety not stated. They don't really know what the variety is. Same thing with Kentucky 31. Same thing with Kenland Red Clover. If it's not listed as that variety on that little seed tag, then it may be just whatever the company decided to put in the bag. So kind of a little bit of buyer beware with these old varieties that you think you're still buying. It may be a little bit of misrepresentation in how it's labeled. Chris, you had a question?
When you were selecting for increased drought tolerance in alfalfa, are you selecting for drought tolerance or water use efficiency or both?
The question was, when we were selecting for drought tolerance in alfalfa, what were we selecting for? Initially, we thought, well, just survivability, but survivability is, for a farmer that's trying to produce hay, that's not viable, and so we needed to have alfalfa varieties that would actually still produce with less water. So initially, in the early years in the 80s, we were looking at, can we reduce the amount of water that we applied, say, and it was in New Mexico we were doing some work. Normally we use 60 inches of water in a season. Could we get the same production with 48 inches by selecting improved genetics to do that? Now, the most advanced lines, we've gone beyond that, and can we actually find those varieties that, say, your highest yield is in that early spring, that first cut. Highest yield, highest quality. If you can capture the first couple of cuts, you've got the majority of the yield for the season, and then shut the water off, let it go into a drought-induced dormancy. It just quits growing when you don't have any water, and go through the whole summer without any water. Which varieties can recover from that, and what we call resilient alfalfa? And that's what's being selected now. Varieties that can go through an extended period of drought without any growth, but still survive and recover and to almost near normal production later on. So,
do you know what the mechanism is for that resilience?
It could be a whole range of things. What we do is just put the, say, 40 or 50 experimental lines into that environment and see which ones are responding to the recovery. We can actually go down and find out which genes those, say if out of 40, 5 varieties seem to be recovering very well, we can go in and find out which those genes those 5 varieties have in common, and which of the other varieties that perform badly, what genes do they have in common. And so we can actually go to the gene level, and that's what's being done on some of the most recent marker-assisted selection is what it comes down to. But finding the genes that are responsible, it can be a whole range of things. Maybe just the efficiency of taking the water up, the whole thing's, whatever plant breeder, as long as it works, we don't care how it got there. So.
Digestible, the armyworms digest it easier
The question is, are there any selection for herbicide resistance or any of the newer herbicides? That, like on the Roundup, that was very expensive to do. That was a GMO. And so most companies now are shying away. They don't feel that they can recover the cost of developing that. So there hasn't been a lot of movement in screening for additional herbicide resistance in the varieties, and mainly because can you recover your costs? And like on Roundup, it was extremely expensive to do that GMO type thing. And so now there's some new technology that they call CRISPR technology, where they can actually modify the alfalfa genetics itself instead of introducing like a bacteria into the alfalfa genome. That's what Roundup came from. It was a bacteria that they put into the DNA of the plants, corn, alfalfa, or whatever. But that's more concerning when you put a bacteria into a plant genetics. The CRISPR technology, we can actually just go in and try to manipulate the existing genetics of alfalfa, and maybe that is less cost prohibitive of doing that. And so I have a lot of hope for CRISPR technology going forward, where we can get maybe armyworm or these other things. And also, the U.S. now classifies that technology as non-GMO. So that removes that stigma, because we're using the existing alfalfa DNA instead of introducing foreign DNA. And so that might, going forward, give us a gene mechanism of improving alfalfa for traits that we haven't been able to breed for in the past. So.
Last question, and then we'll move on.
Is that the same technology that some refer to as gene editing?
Somewhat, yes. Yeah, you can go in and if there's a gene well, like that's what they did on the low lignin. They could take out a certain gene in the pathway of developing lignin in the plant, and then that way that gene's not there in developing the lignin. So, but the CRISPR technology is a technology that could do that. If we had CRISPR 30 years ago, we probably wouldn't have used the other GMO version of doing that type of work. So maybe in the future.
Let's get done. I really think
Thank you.